It's an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you today at the opening of this PDP conference. Thank you, Mary, especially and your team for organizing what I'm sure will prove to be a very interesting couple of days. I want to give a special welcome to our Ukrainian participants, and we in NATO, and I believe I can confidently say Georgia, stand with you as Ukraine faces military aggression from the Russians. And Georgia has also faced military aggression, as have a number of NATO allies in the past. And like allies, Georgia has survived and has moved on to establish a thriving, independent democracy, and it continues to develop and reform to secure the freedom and prosperity that the Georgian people deserve. Ukraine, too, with the dedication of its citizens, of its civil servants, and with the support of its friends in NATO and the European Union, will not only survive, but will thrive as a member of the European community of free and democratic nations. So, through the Professional Development Program, the allies are working side by side with our Georgian and Ukrainian colleagues to help secure this future for these two countries. Since its beginnings in the late 2000s, PDP has become an increasingly important part of NATO's support for Georgia and Ukraine's internal reform efforts. And very much unlike what people typically think about NATO, which is focused on conventional military, these programs are focused on the civilian parts of the nation and its security structures. And today, these programs thrive in Georgia and Ukraine, and a lot of thanks goes to the leadership of these two highly capable managers, Mary Gabashvili and Ov Rabmedson, who are providing the energy to drive these programs forward. And I have no doubt that your teams are going to make a great positive difference in these two countries. So when people think of NATO, again, they generally focus on the armed forces, on nuclear deterrence, that's what people have in mind when they think about defense. However, in recent years, just with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which brought the threat of a conventional war or a nuclear war to a low level, we began to see an increase in unconventional threats to our allies and to our partners, just coming with the emergence of open borders and new technologies and new communications. So as one conventional threat diminishes, these unconventional threats have begun to emerge. And emergent security challenges has become the term that NATO uses among the allies and in public debate to deal with these potential and growing non-traditional threats to our security. Recognizing that these emergent security challenges present real threats to peace, political stability, and economic prosperity, in 2010, NATO founded a new division, Emerging Security Challenges Division. And their job is to address this wide range of non-conventional threats, such as international terrorism, cyber attacks, the use of energy as a political weapon, the threat of smuggling of weapons of mass destruction or nuclear materials, and more recently, the growing threat that all of our nations face from propaganda that is designed to undermine our democratic institutions, and from hybrid warfare threats, which are designed not only to undermine our institutions, but potentially overthrow governments. While Georgia and Ukraine face a conventional threat of Russian occupation forces in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Russian forces in East Ukraine. These countries also face multiple emerging security challenges that threaten their security and stability. Recent events in Georgia and Ukraine illustrate the scope of these threats. For example, just last December, a cyber attack in Ukraine crippled 3 power companies, creating a blackout that affected up to 80,000 people. There's been recent concern in Georgia about the potential return of young men who have been recruited from Georgia to fight with ISIS. 6 men in the last 2 weeks were just arrested in Georgia for attempting to sell nuclear materials to any buyer who was willing to pay that money. There were recent protests in Georgia about over fears of increasing dependence upon Russian gas, where Russia uses gas as a political tool to help control their neighbors. There's concern in Georgia today about the potential sale of a major communications service provider to a Russian company, which would automatically create vulnerabilities within the communications architecture of Georgia for forces that may not have positive influence in Georgia. There's a great fear of Russian money flowing in to affect the elections this year in Georgia. And just by way of example, the Gorchakov Foundation, which some of you may know, has just bought a building in Tbilisi in order to expand their operation in this country. It's no coincidence that it's happening during an election year. There's also a massive growth in Russian propaganda and in the mass media, television, newspapers, NGOs who are funded by Russia, spreading propaganda, even going door to door in villages and neighborhoods to provide information about the dangers of Western unification or the benefits of becoming closer to Russia. So these are a few examples of the challenges Georgia and Ukraine face. The question is, are you ready? Are you ready to deal with these things? And the great dilemma that we face today is that as these countries become increasingly open democracies, become more efficient and transparent, this also creates vulnerabilities for your countries, because as you're open, transparent, democratic, it therefore then allows openings for influence to come from outside that is not interested in your future stability or your prosperity, but in being able to direct or control your countries. Now, as opposed to conventional threats from armed forces, successful deterrence and response to emergent security challenges requires not only comprehensive and cross-government responses, but it requires the inclusion of civil society and businesses in preparation and response. And this creates a requirement for effective institutions that are able to think through these problems, to make decisions, to be able to reach out to civil society, to other organizations, to think unconventionally. It requires effective institutional processes. It requires rules that are based in law that people can rely on. And it requires professional civil servants to manage all these processes. So now you see where I'm going with the professional development program and how it can serve to provide for the increased defense and security of these countries. When we look at PDP, PDP works hand in hand with government institutions and civil servants. And it's not only providing training, but it's working on institutional reforms. And institutional reforms are things that sometimes are difficult to see. As Ove mentioned, there's people that aren't interested in reform. And it's understandable, because if you grow up in a prison, you cannot see the bars. You don't understand what's around you. You don't see these things. So it requires external advice. Somebody could see, somebody comes from outside who can explain the situation. And it requires hand-in-hand work on the inside, so that you can gain the trust and the confidence and also the understanding of the people that you're working with. And so these threats require effective leadership. This leadership has to provide a unifying vision for their government and their societies on where the country is going. This is leadership, and this is what PDP is supporting to train. Help individuals become better leaders. This requires a clear division of responsibilities, and not only responsibility, but authority among individuals and organizations, so that they can respond in a timely manner. This is a difficult process when you are transitioning from, say, a society like the Soviet Union, where everything was driven from the top, and then everything was founded on a sense of fear, that if you stepped out of line, you were crushed. If you didn't follow what you were told, you were crushed. You're moving to a society that is open, it's transparent, and it's flexible. And it has to be flexible, and in order to have that openness, that transparency, that flexibility, that decision-making authority has to be devolved down to the lowest level, where the best experts sit who can make the best decisions that they can based on the information they have. It requires a change in thinking, and this requires in turn a change in laws, processes, procedures, and institutional structures. These things are difficult to achieve, but they're happening, and we see it happening every day in Georgia, for example. So I'll give you a few examples of what are current issues and how PDP is related. Looking at cybersecurity, for example, this is an area where Georgia has moved a long way. From the 2008 war, when Georgia was subject to the cybersecurity attacks in concert with the Russian conventional attack, there has been great progress, and part of that progress has been supported by the professional development program. We began working on cybersecurity issues already back in 2009, and the Georgians have since established the Data Protection Agency and the Cybersecurity Bureau in the Ministry of Defense. They've had numerous trainings, conferences, and the Georgians now are doing this themselves. It's, if we're talking about capacity building, well, this is one of those successful stories. And this, of course, has not just been professional development program. There have been a lot of other supporters in international organizations, and as well as the desire and the talent that's come from inside Georgia to make these things happen. If we look at another area, and that is soft power. This is one that I think just now NATO, the allies, Georgia and Ukraine are beginning to come to terms with. What is soft power? Russia has essentially taken a Western idea and turned it on its head. The idea that NGOs who have come to help a country prosper, to develop, to reform, in order to supply better living conditions, better democracy, and more rights to their citizens. That's what Western democracies are about. The Russians have taken that and turned it on its head to use this soft power and these NGOs in order to further their national power interests in these countries. And I think the reality is the Russians see these Western institutions dedicated to democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and individual liberty as somehow being a great conspiracy against the dominance of the Russian government within what they consider their sphere of influence. And they have just taken this idea and turned it on its head in order to increase their influence. The difference is their focus is not for the benefit of the countries that they are working in. It is for their benefit. It is for their power, their influence, and their ability to control their neighboring countries. This is a fundamentally, philosophically different approach from what the Western NGOs are doing. Television, radio, newspapers are all now supporting Russian propaganda activities in Georgia. And I want to say all because there are independents, there are other voices, but there is huge money being poured into these activities in Georgia, and they are having an influence, and it's impossible to avoid. If you have Russian language as your primary language, and you turn on the TV, and what you get is Russian language television that's coming from Moscow, you get Moscow's view. And they're extremely skilled at this, extremely skilled. Even you watch TV for a few days, Russian TV, you begin to believe what they're telling you. It's because it seems to make sense. But they leave out, of course, any other critical voices. And this affects the way people think. It affects the way they view Western institutions, Western democracy. They even will undermine and make decisions that undermine their own prosperity and their own future. We see this happening in the United States. This is not unique to the former Soviet Union. This is happening in the United States, where you have individuals who are watching certain sources of media that are designed specifically to sway them in a particular direction, and these individuals then make decisions which are absolutely counter to their own interests. So this is not a unique phenomenon to the Soviet Union, but this is a well-developed and old way of swaying a society to increase power of certain individuals who are looking for it. So we are now with the professional development program supported by nations such as the UK and Estonia and Latvia with the Strategic Center of Excellence, Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, working with the Georgians on how to reply to this threat. Because you're in an election year. What happens in an election year if you end up with Russian-supported parliamentarians in your parliament who are being supported by them in order to change the direction of your country? It's a serious question. And if they can't succeed in changing the perception of the population away, then what they do is they proceed to try to interfere, to destabilize, to freeze things in place so that progress can't be made, so decisions can't be made, so you cannot move forward. And this is the same methodology the Russians use with their frozen conflicts. South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, now Ukraine, Moldova. These are used in order to maintain political influence on the country, and instability is a method of doing that and maintaining power. And if they can't do it with military force, they'll try to do it with political initiatives. And it's not just in Georgia and Ukraine, it's in Europe also. And you see Russian money pouring into right-wing groups to try to pursue the same ends. So we are faced with a growing challenge. And this is going to take a lot of talent. It's going to take leadership. It is going to take changes, fundamental changes in the way government business is done, the way decisions are made. And this is where the professional development program can help. And as we look out into the future of the professional development program, I would see that the Allies would move into something maybe that's a little more permanent, because this is not the time to phase out. This is the time to really focus and work, because this is the vulnerable time. You're on a step at the verge of great success, particularly in Georgia. The changes that are happening in the next few years, if they continue, Georgia is going to be a completely different country in 15 years. It will be more European. It will be more democratic. It will be market-oriented. It will be more prosperous. People will be freer. And this is not the time to let up on this push to bring this to the people of Georgia. I would say the same for Ukraine. The time is not now. Now that Russia is showing their aggressive nature. They are demonstrating, they are working, they are pouring money, but they themselves are on the verge of great calamity and vulnerability. And time is on our side. It's on the side of freedom. It is on the side of democracy. And we just have to work for it and pursue it and not let up. So I think with that, I have reached my 20 minutes, and thank you very much.